June 11, 1944, 5 days after D-Day. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein sat in the command post of the Panzer Lehr Division, burying his face in his hands. He was one of Germany's most experienced tank commanders, a man who had fought with Rommel in Africa, a man who knew the smell of desert dust and the sound of British artillery. He was not a man easily rattled, but what he was seeing in Normandy was something new, something impossible. He had just tried to move a column of his elite tanks toward the front lines during daylight hours. In Poland, in France in 1940, even in Russia, moving a tank column was a standard operation. You gave the order, the engines roared, and the steel moved. But here, in the hedgerows of Normandy, the moment his tanks moved, the sky fell on them. Not just a few planes. The sky was black with American fighter bombers. They were everywhere. They attacked everything that moved. Tanks, trucks, motorcycles, even single messengers on bicycles. Bayerlein grabbed a piece of paper and began to write a report that would make its way up the chain of command. He didn't write about American bravery. He didn't write about their tactical brilliance. He wrote about their stuff. He wrote that the Americans were fighting a war of material richness that defied comprehension. He described an enemy who didn't seem to care about conserving ammunition, an enemy who would use 1,000 artillery shells to silence a single sniper, an enemy who treated high-explosive ordnance like it was free. The report he drafted that day captured a chilling realization that was spreading like a virus through the German high command. They realized they weren't just fighting an army. They were fighting a factory. They were fighting an industrial conveyor belt that stretched from Detroit to the beaches of France, dumping more steel, fuel, and explosives onto the continent in a single day than Germany could produce in a month. Bayerlein looked at his staff officers, men who were exhausted, dusting plaster from their uniforms, as another American barrage hammered their position. He realized then that all the tactical genius in the world, all the superior German engineering of the Tiger and Panther tanks, all the discipline of the Wehrmacht, didn't matter. The math didn't work. The Americans had brought an industrial apocalypse to France. But to understand why this realization shattered the German spirit so completely, you first have to understand the world they were living in, a world of scarcity that you and I can barely imagine. Before we go on to next, I want to ask you to subscribe right now and become a member of this channel. Do it so you never miss moments like this, moments where we tell the truth in a calm, clear way. If 1,000 of you are watching, I hope all thousands of you join us, because this community is growing and your presence truly matters here. So to understand the shock the German generals felt, you have to look at the German army of 1944 through an honest lens. History channels often show you the newsreels of sleek panzer tanks and mechanized columns, giving the impression of a high-tech, futuristic war machine. But by 1944, that was a lie. The reality was that the German army was a pauper's army. It was an army of horses, bicycles, and rationing. Germany was being strangled. Allied bombing campaigns had smashed their factories and rail lines. Fuel was liquid gold. Every drop of gasoline had to be accounted for. Tank commanders were ordered to turn off their engines whenever possible to save fuel. Artillery officers were given strict quotas on how many shells they could fire per day. A German soldier knew that if he fired his weapon, he might not get a resupply for days. They were fighting a war of make do. They were masters of recycling, repairing, and scavenging, because they had no choice. So when the German high command looked at the invasion of Normandy, they projected their own limitations onto the Americans. They assumed the Allies would have the same problems. They calculated that an invasion force would need to capture a major port immediately, Cherbourg or Le Havre, because no army could sustain itself over a beach. They assumed the Americans would have to conserve ammunition because supply lines across an ocean are fragile. They assumed there would be pauses in the battle where the Americans would have to stop and wait for fuel. This was their fatal mistake. They were playing chess while counting their pawns, assuming the other guy was doing the same. They didn't realize the opponent wasn't just bringing more pieces. He was bringing the entire chessboard, the table, and the building the game was being played in. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. You are a German officer who has to fill out paperwork to get a new pair of boots, and you are looking through your binoculars at an enemy who changes his socks twice a day and throws the dirty ones away. You are commanding a unit where you count every artillery shell like it's a diamond, and you are watching an enemy fire a barrage that costs $1 million just to clear a patch of trees. This wasn't just a military disadvantage, it was a psychological hammer blow. And nowhere was this hammer blow felt more than when they looked out at the English Channel and saw something that shouldn't have been there. If you were a German observer on the cliffs of Normandy in mid-June 1944, and you looked out at the horizon, your brain would struggle to process the visual information. The sea was gone. In its place was a city of steel. We talked about the ships in previous videos, but today I want you to focus on what those ships were doing. They weren't just sitting there. They were unloading. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West, received reports from his intelligence officers that sounded like hallucinations. The reports stated that the Americans weren't just landing troops. They were landing an entire civilization. They were offloading trucks by the thousands, specifically the 2 5-ton deuce-and-a-half trucks. These vehicles are the unsung heroes of the war. While the German army was still using 7 million horses to move supplies, the Americans brought a truck for every squad. German generals watched in horror as the Red Ball Express began to form, a conveyor belt of trucks running 24 hours a day, bumper to bumper. But it wasn't just the vehicles. It was what was inside them. German patrols capturing American prisoners or overrunning American positions found something that shook them more than any weapon: fresh food. A German soldier on the front line was eating Käsebrot, a hard bread that was often mixed with sawdust to bulk it up, and canned meat that was barely edible. Then they would capture an American Jeep and find chocolate bars, instant coffee, cigarettes, and fresh white bread. One German officer wrote in his diary about finding a tin of cake sent from a family in Ohio. Cake. He was sitting in a hole in the ground, covered in lice, rationing his ammunition, and his enemy was receiving mail-order cake. This realization rippled up the chain of command to generals like Rommel. Rommel knew logistics better than anyone. He had lost in North Africa because he ran out of gas. Now, seeing the American beachhead, he realized he was facing an enemy who had conquered the problem of supply. The Americans had turned the English Channel into a highway, but the Germans still thought they had one card left to play. They thought, okay, they have supplies now, but winter is coming. They don't have a deep water port. The storms will starve them. The Americans, however, knew the Germans were thinking this, and they had prepared a technological surprise that would leave German engineers speechless. The German defensive strategy relied on one absolute certainty. To land heavy supplies, you need a harbor with cranes, docks, and breakwaters. You cannot offload a tank on a sandy beach in rough water. Therefore, the Germans heavily fortified the ports of Cherbourg, Le Havre, and Calais, assuming that if they held the ports, the Allied invasion would wither and die on the vine. Then came the mulberries. This is one of the greatest engineering flexes in human history. The Allies knew they couldn't capture a port intact, so they built 2 massive artificial harbors in England, towed them across the channel piece by piece, and sank them into place off the coast of Normandy. We are talking about 600,000 tons of concrete. They built breakwaters the size of apartment buildings. They built floating roadways that rose and fell with the tide. When German reconnaissance planes finally got a look at what was happening off Arromanches and Omaha Beach, the photo analysts couldn't believe what they were seeing. They reported to their superiors that the Americans hadn't just captured a harbor, they had brought one with them. General Westphal, von Rundstedt's chief of staff, stared at the aerial reconnaissance photos. He saw a fully functioning port where, a week ago, there had been nothing but open ocean. He saw ships unloading directly onto piers, trucks driving off the ships and straight onto the beach. The strategic calculation that Germany had bet the war on, that the Allies would starve without a port, evaporated in seconds. The psychological impact of the mulberries cannot be overstated. It told the German high command that the Americans were not bound by the rules of warfare or even the rules of geography. If they needed a mountain moved, they moved it. If they needed a harbor, they built it. It signaled that there was no limitation to what American industry could produce. If they could build a portable harbor, what else could they do? The German generals were about to find out that the mulberries were just the delivery system. The real horror was the infinite nature of what was coming across those floating piers. Let's talk about the concept of infinite. In war, nothing is supposed to be infinite. You run out of men, you run out of bullets, you run out of courage. But to the German generals facing the American sector, the flow of materials seemed to have no end. It defied the laws of economics they had learned in military academies. Take artillery, for example. In the German army, a battery commander might have a stockpile of 50 shells. He would have to calculate precise coordinates, wait for a high-value target, and fire sparingly. He was a sniper with a cannon. The American doctrine was different. If an American unit received fire from a patch of woods, they didn't send a scout to find the exact location. They simply leveled the entire forest. There is a famous account from a German interrogation of a captured American artillery officer. The German asked, "How do you calculate your firing solutions so quickly?" The American looked confused and said, "We don't really calculate. We just call for a time on target, and everything in the grid square dies." The German officer didn't believe him. He thought it was propaganda. Until he saw it happen. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Corps, was a hard-bitten Nazi loyalist. He was not prone to defeatism. But even he began to crack under the weight of American fire superiority. He reported to Rommel that his tanks were being destroyed before they could even get into visual range of the enemy. He wasn't losing tanks to other tanks, he was losing them to a curtain of steel that fell from the sky. The Americans were using proximity fuses, shells that exploded in the air above the target, raining shrapnel down into the foxholes. This was top-secret technology. The Germans didn't have it. The disparity was so great that German soldiers began to refer to the American artillery planes, the little Piper Cubs that spotted for the guns, as the angels of death. If you saw a Piper Cub, you knew that within 2 minutes, the ground you were standing on would cease to exist. This wasn't war as the Germans knew it. It was industrial extermination. And as bad as the artillery was, something else was happening in the skies that made German movement impossible. A phenomenon that the German generals called Die Jabo, the fighter bombers. And what they did to the German supply lines would make the mightiest army in Europe look like a broken toy. The German generals called them Jabos, short for Jag Bomber or Hunter Bombers. But the name doesn't capture the terror they inspired. By late June 1944, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had effectively ceased to exist over Normandy. The sky belonged exclusively to the Americans and the British. And because the Americans had unlimited fuel, they didn't just fly missions, they loitered. Before we go into next, I want to ask you to subscribe right now and become a member of this channel. Do it so you never miss moments like this. Moments where we tell the truth in a calm, clear way. If 1,000 of you are watching, I hope all thousands of you join us, because this community is growing, and your presence truly matters here. So imagine you are a German division commander. You have a map, and you can see a perfect opportunity to flank the Americans. You have the tanks, you have the men, and you have the skill. But you can't move. If you put a vehicle on the road during daylight hours, it will die. The American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons were patrolling the roads like sharks. General Bayerlein, the man we met at the beginning of this story, reported that his Panzer Lehr division didn't lose its strength in a great tank battle against other tanks. He lost it on the road to the front. He described the road as a coffin. He said, "By noon I had lost 40 fuel trucks and 90 other vehicles. My division was being dismantled piece by piece before we even saw an American soldier. This total air dominance broke the fundamental mechanics of the German war machine." The German army relied on blitzkrieg, lightning war, which requires speed and movement. But American industry had turned the speed limit to 0. German generals were forced to move only at night, hiding in barns and under trees during the day, while the Americans moved freely 24 hours a day. And the reason the Americans could keep thousands of planes in the air wasn't just about the number of pilots. It was the fuel. Germany was synthesizing fuel from coal because they had lost their oil supplies. It was a scarce, precious resource. The Americans, meanwhile, had laid an underwater pipeline, PLUTO, pipelines under the ocean, to pump gasoline directly from England to France. They had so much fuel they were using it to clean their uniforms. To a German mechanic wiping his hands on a dirty rag to save a drop of oil, this was inconceivable, but the skies were just the delivery method. The real nightmare was on the ground, in the terrifying math of replacement. There is a myth that German tanks were better than American tanks. And strictly speaking, it's true. The German Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering. Thick armor, a terrifying 88mm gun, and optics that could snipe a fly from a mile away. An American Sherman tank was, by comparison, a mass-produced tractor with a gun on it. In a one-on-one duel, the Tiger won almost every time. But war isn't a duel. War is economics. German generals quickly realized that for every Tiger tank they managed to build, the Americans were building 20 Shermans. Field Marshal Rommel watched his panzer divisions whittle away, day by day. When a Tiger tank was destroyed, it was gone forever. Germany didn't have the spare parts, the raw steel, or the factories to replace it. A lost Tiger was a tragedy. But when a German gunner destroyed a Sherman tank, he would look through his periscope the next morning and see 2 more standing in its place. The Americans had replacement depots just behind the lines. These were parking lots filled with hundreds of brand-new tanks, waiting for crews. If a unit lost a tank, they simply drove back to the depot, signed a piece of paper, and drove back to the front in a factory-fresh vehicle that same afternoon. General von Luttwitz, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division, wrote a report that sounded like a man losing his mind. He said, "It is depressing to fight against an enemy who can replace a destroyed tank faster than we can reload our guns." The German soldiers began to feel like they were fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, and 2 more appear. This destroyed morale faster than any propaganda broadcast. What is the point of being the better soldier, the better shot, or the better tactician if the enemy has a cheat code for infinite respawns? The Americans treated tanks like ammunition, disposable, replaceable, and endless. And this attitude of disposability revealed something about the American mindset that the Germans found deeply unsettling. In the German military tradition, equipment was sacred. You cared for your rifle, your truck, and your boots because you might not get another one. This created a culture of repair and conservation. But as the Normandy campaign dragged on, German intelligence officers began to notice something strange about the equipment the Americans left behind. They found trucks abandoned by the side of the road simply because they had a flat tire or a minor engine issue. The Americans hadn't bothered to fix them. They just hopped into another truck and kept moving. They found jerry cans, the fuel canisters, littered by the thousands in ditches. The Germans designed their fuel cans to be robust and reusable. The Americans mass-produced millions of them and threw them away when they were empty. To the German high command, this looked like waste. They initially thought, the Americans are undisciplined, they are careless. But slowly, the terrifying truth dawned on them. It wasn't carelessness. It was arrogance. It was the arrogance of a nation so wealthy, so industrially potent, that they didn't need to fix a flat tire. This waste was a weapon. It was a psychological display of power. It told the Germans, we have so much stuff that we don't even care about it. While a German unit might be halted for 2 days, waiting for a spare part for a transmission, an American unit would just push the broken truck into a ditch and uncrate a new one. This realization permeated the highest levels of the German command. They weren't fighting a military force anymore. They were fighting a natural disaster. An avalanche doesn't care if you are a black belt in karate. It just buries you. And by mid-July 1944, the most famous German general of them all decided he had seen enough. He sat down to write a letter to Adolf Hitler that would serve as the death certificate of the Third Reich. On July 15, 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the hero of the German people, composed a teletype message to the Führer. Rommel had spent weeks visiting the front lines. He had seen the Jabos darken the skies. He had seen the mulberry harbors. He had seen the endless columns of fresh American troops and the shattered remnants of his own elite divisions. He knew the war was lost, not because of a lack of courage, but because of math. In his report, he didn't use flowery language. He used the cold, hard facts of industry. He wrote, "The enemy has total command of the air. The supply of ammunition and fuel is unprecedented. The material richness of the enemy is crushing our brave soldiers." He went on to detail the losses: 97,000 German casualties, including 28 generals and 354 commanders. And against this, they had received only 6,000 replacements. The ratio was impossible. Rommel concluded with a sentence that was essentially treason, a sentence that demanded Hitler end the war immediately. The unequal struggle is nearing its end. I must ask you to draw the necessary conclusions from this situation. The necessary conclusions. That was code for surrender. Rommel was telling Hitler that no amount of fanaticism could stop a production line. He was telling him that the American factory had beaten the German warrior. 2 days later, Rommel's staff car was strafed by a British fighter plane, a Jabo, and he was severely wounded, ending his command. But his words remained on paper, a testament to the moment when the German generals realized that the industrial might of America had made their defeat inevitable. Hitler, of course, ignored the letter. He ranted about secret weapons and willpower. But the generals on the ground knew the truth. They looked at the horizon, at the endless line of ships, and they knew that the war had been decided not on the battlefield, but in the steel mills of Pittsburgh and the assembly lines of Detroit. We often romanticize World War II as a battle of wits, of strategy, of brave men storming beaches, and it was all of those things. But at its core, the victory in Europe was a victory of production. It was a victory of the assembly line over the artisan. The German generals at Normandy were some of the most skilled military commanders in history. They knew how to fight. But they were crushed by a force they couldn't shoot. You can kill a soldier, you can destroy a tank, but you cannot kill the industrial capacity of a continent-sized nation that is fully mobilized for war. When Fritz Bayerlein buried his face in his hands, or when Rommel wrote that final letter, they were acknowledging a new reality of warfare. They were acknowledging that in the modern age, the side with the biggest factories wins. The Americans didn't just outfight the Germans, they outproduced them, outsupplied them, and outspent them. They buried the Third Reich under a mountain of steel and aluminum. As promised, I want to leave you with an image that sums this up perfectly. There is a photo taken in late 1944 of a massive Allied supply dump in France. It stretches for miles, millions of crates, thousands of tires, endless rows of tanks. When a captured German general was shown this photo, he didn't get angry. He didn't scream. He simply stared at it for a long time, handed it back, and said, "I don't know how you expect us to fight this." He was right. They couldn't. If you found this story of industrial warfare fascinating, you need to see what happened on the other side of the world. The Japanese faced an even more terrifying realization when they saw the American fleet. Click this video right here to hear what Japanese admirals said when they saw the U.S. Navy return from the dead. You won't believe their reaction.